The relationship between intelligence agencies and presidential authority has always existed in a tension that most people never fully see. What we're witnessing right now isn't just political theater or routine bureaucratic friction. It's something far more structural, something that reveals how power actually operates when it conflicts with itself. When former intelligence officials and military strategists who once served under different administrations begin coordinating outside formal channels. When special operations expertise gets redirected toward domestic political outcomes rather than foreign objectives, we're looking at a fundamental question about who actually governs. This isn't about one president or one party. It's about whether elected authority can function when permanent institutions, the intelligence apparatus, the military-industrial complex, the deep state if you want to use that term, decide that authority threatens their interests. The economics behind this are just as important as the politics. These agencies don't just gather intelligence, they manage contracts worth billions. They shape foreign policy that determines which corporations profit from military engagements, which governments receive support, which resources get controlled. When that system feels threatened, it protects itself. What we're seeing is institutional power defending institutional power, and the methods being employed tell us everything about how fragile democratic accountability really is when it confronts entrenched interest. Let me take you back to something that happened during the Cold War. Something that most history books gloss over, but that tells us everything about how power really works in this country. In the early 1960s, when John F. Kennedy began questioning the Bay of Pigs invasion, when he started expressing doubts about escalating in Vietnam, when he suggested that maybe the CIA had become too powerful and needed to be splintered into 1,000 pieces, something interesting happened. The institutional response wasn't public debate or democratic deliberation. It was quiet, it was coordinated, and it was absolutely ruthless in protecting the prerogatives of unelected power. Now, I'm not here to relitigate Kennedy conspiracy theories or dive into speculation about what happened in Dallas. What I'm interested in is the pattern, the structure, the way that institutions respond when their authority gets challenged by someone who theoretically has more democratic legitimacy than they do. Because what we're seeing right now with Trump, regardless of how you feel about the man personally, regardless of your politics, is that same institutional response playing out in real time. And we need to understand it not as a unique phenomenon, not as something specific to this moment or this president, but as part of a much longer historical pattern about how American power actually functions when the facade of democracy conflicts with the reality of institutional control. The intelligence community in the United States isn't just a collection of agencies that gather information. It's a massive economic structure, a jobs program for hundreds of thousands of people, a contracting bonanza for private corporations, and most importantly, it's a policy-making apparatus that often operates with more autonomy than elected officials. When you have 17 different intelligence agencies, when you have a budget that's partially classified so even Congress doesn't know the full scope of spending, when you have legal authorities that allow surveillance and action without meaningful oversight, you're not talking about public servants who answer to democracy. You're talking about a power structure that has its own interests, its own ideology, its own vision for how the world should work. And here's where it gets really interesting from an economic standpoint. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in 1961, that wasn't just about weapons manufacturers. It was about the entire ecosystem that benefits from permanent conflict, from global military presence, from the idea that American security requires bases in more than 70 countries, requires intervention in dozens of conflicts, requires a state of perpetual emergency that justifies extraordinary powers and extraordinary budgets. The intelligence agencies sit at the heart of that system. They provide the justifications for intervention. They manage the relationships with foreign assets and allied services. They create the threat assessments that determine funding levels and policy priorities. This is a trillion-dollar ecosystem, and it doesn't react kindly when someone threatens to disrupt it. Now, Trump came into office with a lot of rhetoric about ending endless wars, about questioning NATO, about reassessing relationships with traditional adversaries, about draining the swamp. You can debate whether he was sincere about any of that. You can point to all the ways his actual policies contradicted his rhetoric, But the perception within the intelligence community was clear from the beginning. This was someone who didn't respect their authority, who didn't defer to their expertise, who might actually follow through on some of these disruptive promises. And the response started immediately. You had the Russia investigation, which, regardless of its merits, became a tool for constraining presidential action on foreign policy. You had unprecedented leaks from within the intelligence community designed to damage the administration. You had former officials taking to cable news every single night to question the president's loyalty, his competence, his fitness for office. But what we're talking about now goes beyond leaks and media appearances. When we talk about special forces, when we talk about operational expertise being deployed, we're talking about the possibility of coordinated action that goes far beyond the normal bounds of bureaucratic resistance. Special Forces operators are trained in very specific skills. They know how to organize clandestine operations, how to manage assets, how to create networks that can operate below the visibility of normal oversight. And when former operators, people who've left official service but maintain all their relationships and skills, when they start coordinating around a political objective, you have to ask yourself what exactly that looks like in practice. This isn't about storming the White House or some kind of military coup in the traditional sense. American power is far too sophisticated for that. What it looks like is information operations, strategic leaks timed for maximum political impact, coordination with media allies to shape narratives, pressure on congressional allies to limit presidential action, and perhaps most importantly, the activation of what intelligence people call the interagency process to simply prevent presidential directives from being implemented. You can have all the authority in the world on paper, but if the people responsible for implementing your orders simply refuse, if they slow walk everything, if they find legal and procedural reasons why things can't be done, your authority becomes theoretical rather than real. And this is where the economics really matters, because these aren't just patriots acting out of concern for national security. These are people whose careers, whose consultant fees, whose board memberships, whose speaking fees, whose entire post-government income streams depend on maintaining the current system. When you leave the CIA or the NSA or military intelligence, you don't just retire. You go to work for defense contractors, for private intelligence firms, for consulting groups that advise foreign governments and multinational corporations. Your value in that marketplace is directly connected to your relationships, your clearances, your ongoing access to classified information and decision makers. If the system changes, if priorities shift, if the endless war paradigm actually ends, your market value drops precipitously. So when we see former intelligence officials organizing, when we see them using their operational expertise for political objectives, we need to understand that they're not just defending abstract principles about democracy or national security. They're defending their economic interests, their class position, their role in a global system that has been extraordinarily profitable for a very small group of people. The revolving door between intelligence agencies and private contractors isn't a bug in the system. It's the whole point. It's how you ensure that people making decisions in government are thinking about their future employment, about staying in good standing with the institutional consensus, about not rocking the boat too much. Now let's talk about what this means for democracy, because that's really the core question here. We're taught in civics class that elections determine who governs, that voters choose their leaders, that those leaders then implement policies reflecting the will of the people. But what happens when there's a permanent bureaucracy that has its own interests, its own ideology, its own sense of mission that exists independently of electoral outcomes? What happens when that bureaucracy has the tools of surveillance, of secrecy, of operational capability that far exceed anything available to elected officials? You end up with a situation where formal democracy continues, people vote, presidents get inaugurated, but actual policy-making power resides somewhere else entirely. This isn't a partisan observation. We saw the same dynamics with Obama when he came in promising to close Guantanamo, to end the wars, to roll back the surveillance state. The institutional response was to constrain him, to present him with realistic options that all involved continuing existing policies, to make him feel like the adult in the room meant accepting the wisdom of the permanent bureaucracy. And for the most part, he did. He expanded the drone program. He prosecuted more whistleblowers than all previous presidents combined. He maintained the extraordinary rendition program. He kept the wars going. The institution shaped the president rather than the other way around. With Trump, the dynamic is more confrontational because Trump himself is more confrontational, because he doesn't have the institutional deference that someone like Obama had, because he's willing to say out loud things that threaten the consensus. But the underlying structure is the same. You have unelected officials with enormous power working to constrain and control elected authority. And when we talk about special forces involvement, when we talk about operational capabilities being deployed, we're talking about an escalation of that constraint, a willingness to use more aggressive methods to achieve institutional objectives. Think about what special forces training actually involves. It's not just physical conditioning and weapons handling. It's psychological operations. It's building and managing human networks. It's creating cover stories and legends. It's operating in denied areas without official support. These are skills that translate very directly to domestic political operations if you decide to use them that way. You can create whisper networks that feed information to journalists. You can organize pressure campaigns that appear grassroots but are actually coordinated from above. You can identify vulnerabilities in political opponents and exploit them systematically. You can use all the tradecraft of foreign operations in a domestic context, and if you're careful, no one ever knows you're doing it. And here's the thing that should concern everyone, regardless of their politics. Once you normalize this kind of institutional resistance, once you accept that unelected officials can coordinate to undermine elected authority when they disagree with it, you've fundamentally abandoned any pretense of democratic governance. Maybe you think it's justified in Trump's case. Maybe you think he's so dangerous that extraordinary measures are warranted. But the precedent doesn't end with Trump. The next time there's a president who threatens institutional interests, whether from the left or the right, the same playbook will be available. The same networks will activate. The same justifications about protecting democracy or national security will be deployed. We saw hints of this with Bernie Sanders when he was running in the primaries. You had former intelligence officials going on television talking about how his policies would weaken American security, how his foreign policy views were naive or dangerous. You had whisper campaigns about his electability, his health, his supporters. Now imagine if he'd actually won. Imagine if he'd come into office promising to cut the defense budget by 50%, to end the interventions, to declassify the intelligence budget, and subject it to real congressional oversight. Do you think the institutional response would have been any different? Do you think the same people now organizing against Trump wouldn't have organized against Sanders? This is about power protecting itself. It's about a class of people who benefit enormously from the current system, refusing to allow that system to change, regardless of what voters want. And the tools they have available are so much more sophisticated than what previous generations had to work with. The surveillance capabilities alone are staggering. The NSA can monitor every electronic communication, can track movements, can build comprehensive profiles of anyone they target. The CIA has decades of experience running influence operations, manipulating foreign elections, organizing coups against governments they don't like. When you turn those capabilities inward, when you decide that domestic politics is just another operational environment, the advantage is entirely on the side of institutional power. What makes this moment different, what makes it particularly dangerous, is that it's all happening in plain sight, and we're being asked to celebrate it. Every time a former intelligence official goes on television to criticize the president, they're treated as a hero, a patriot standing up for democracy. Every leak from the intelligence community is reported breathlessly as evidence of Trump's unfitness. Every story about officials resisting or constraining the president is framed as the adults in the room saving us from catastrophe. And maybe some of that is true. Maybe Trump is as dangerous as they say. But we're not interrogating the deeper question about whether unelected officials should have this kind of power at all. Because the people organizing this resistance, the people deploying their special forces training and intelligence expertise, they're not accountable to anyone. They can't be voted out. They don't have to explain their actions or justify their decisions in any public forum. They operate in classified spaces. They coordinate through informal networks. They have legal protections that shield them from oversight. This is the deep state that people talk about, not as a conspiracy theory, but as a simple description of how power actually works when institutional interests conflict with democratic authority. And the economic dimension can't be separated from any of this. These operations cost money. The coordination requires funding, the think tanks that employ former officials, the private intelligence firms that provide them consulting fees, the defense contractors that hire them for their expertise and relationships. All of this is part of an economic ecosystem worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. When that ecosystem feels threatened, it defends itself. The people benefiting from it aren't going to just accept a president who wants to disrupt their business model. So when we see reporting about former allies sending special forces to stop Trump, we need to understand it as part of this larger pattern. We need to ask who these former allies are, what their economic interests might be, what relationships they maintain with active duty personnel and current officials, what capabilities they actually have to influence events. We need to question the narrative that frames this as heroic resistance rather than institutional self-preservation. And most importantly, we need to think about what it means for democracy when the real power to govern doesn't reside with elected officials at all, but with a permanent class of security professionals who answer only to themselves and their class interests. This is the reality of American power in the 21st century, and until we're willing to confront it honestly, we're going to keep pretending that elections matter more than they actually do.